kiss for you.
The iPad Pro M5 is an incredible device for specific people. The too long didn't watch of this is that I want to mention 3 major points here, and if all you get out of this video is those 3 points, then that will be a success. As a side note, I'm trying to record all this audio on the iPad Pro's microphone specifically, so you can hear how that sounds in different environments. The first major point I want to mention here is that I believe the iPad Pro M5 is not for most people, including for most professionals. Second point is that I believe that it won't be a replacement for a main computer. However, it can replace a computer, but it can't be your main one. And number 3, do not let anyone tell you that you are making a bad choice by buying an iPad to replace something you own. Only you can make that decision. If the thing you can do and are doing on a laptop can be simplified or improved by using an iPad and an iPad OS over Windows, then that's fantastic. That's honestly the boat that I'm sort of in this, and I think it's really annoying when people kind of pretend like people like me that are trying to do this don't exist and are making a bad choice. No iPad Pro will be for everyone, not even all professionals, and that's okay, and I believe that's sort of mostly the point. So if all you get out of this video is those 3 points, I think that's pretty much a success, but let's move on. I want to do 2 main things in this video. Talk about and sort of review the iPad Pro, as well as the features on it, as well as trying to transfer a lot of the elements that I use my laptop for and make them, usable on an iPad, right? So my iPad here, the M5, is trying to replace my aging 2018 MacBook Pro with its 8th Gen i5, 8 gigs of DDR3 RAM, all that, right? My main PC, however, is a Lenovo Legion T7 desktop, which I reviewed on the channel here if you want more info about that. The iPad Pro is not trying to reduce or remove the need to use my full main computer. It's just trying to replace the need to use my old MacBook Pro. I used my laptop, the MacBook there, before I got my current Lenovo PC for a variety of things, including photo editing, video editing, motion graphics, and development work. So the goal of the replacement here is to get as many of those elements working and actually wanting to be used on an iPad as possible, right? It doesn't matter if it's working. If it's kludgy and irritating and I don't want to use it, that's not really a success, right? So the process here is going to be split up into 4 broad sections. The first is identifying what the iPad is capable of doing. Second, what the iPad does poorly and why you still need a main computer. Third, what it does well and where it actually is above any competition, including laptops. And fourth is the transition and sort of the more guide focus, where we start talking about and demonstrating converting your workflow and use case from a laptop to an iPad with specific use case examples to really showcase how it plays out. So off with the first section, we're going to be talking about capabilities. Quick rundown of the capabilities of this new device. This iPad Pro M5 can be used for a ton of things. Photo editing, video editing, motion graphics work, development through things like Swift Code, 3D modeling applications are usable through things like Nomad Sculpt and eventually Blender. It can animate and do animation through 2D animating apps like ToonSquid or Calipeg, or even 3D animation ones like Noemi. You can draw and have drawing apps with things like Clip Studio Paint or Procreate. On top of the standard amount of web browsing, emails, mobile games, AAA games, and a cavalcade of note-taking apps. So that's a lot of things this device can do. What's important, however, is what it really excels at. In my opinion, the iPad Pro really excels at the drawing, modeling, and note-taking pieces, with everything else being on a scale of pretty good to a half-big mess. So now we get on to what I think that the iPad does poorly, because I think understanding, its capabilities is good, but I think, what a lot of people will automatically go to is, oh, this sucks for this, or this isn't good for this, or whatever. But I do want to kind of mention what I think the iPad struggles with, because if you saw the previous video I did on the visual demonstration about why iPad OS sucks, you'll know that a lot of it comes down to its software implementation and its software versions of certain apps. So let's just talk about that real quick. I would say that video editing is a good example of something that's in the middle, in terms of there is a good amount of apps available that have relatively broad functionality, things like Final Cut Pro, DaVinci Resolve, LumaFusion, to free options like iMovie, CapCut, VidMerger. Resolve is also free, but there is a paid version as well that is available, so I'm going to lump that in with the paid/professional software. So the availability of good software is not an issue like it would have been previously in previous versions of iPadOS, where you just were not able to get a good video editor. It wasn't to that sense. That's not the case anymore. So that begs the question of, well, what's the problem? Well, it is still iPadOS, even with the adjustments made to feel, adding things like a real file manager and an import system. It is still limited in how much you can import, though, and how much you can reasonably use. What I mean by that is, by default, the apps are kind of janky, which I'll explain about in a bit, as well as the importing system being a little bit rough, a little bit slower. There's some workflow things that are a little bit hedged down, if you will. iPads are still very efficient with memory, meaning background apps will lose their spot when the device is pushed, more aggressively than a laptop would. If you're interested about this problem, it's called the Jettison problem. You can learn more about this process in the Snazzy Labs video that he made on it.
Is built to preserve work at all costs, even if it means slowing things down. When the 16 gig Mac is asked to load that 13 gig model, the total demand from the OS and the app does exceed the physical RAM available, but the Mac doesn't fail, it negotiates. It activates virtual memory, pushing other apps and even its own idle system processes into a swap file on the SSD. The model loads, the workload completes, and the only cost is that molasses feeling of that swap. iPadOS, by contrast, makes the opposite trade-off, and that is to preserve responsiveness at all costs. It has no memory swap.
But fundamentally, this combined with the import limit means that you'll be better suited handling larger workflows on a laptop device because it can handle that memory management better, and you're more suited to using easier workflows and less intensive projects on the iPad, even if your iPad is technically at this point stronger than your laptop because of that Jettison issue. For me, however, that is not as big of a deal since I don't tend to record any 4K 60 FPS raw codecs video. But I do tend to have a high bitrate on my videos because my gaming channel tries to showcase the games in the best possible light it can, and that leads to higher bit rates, less compression, which does lead to larger file sizes. So a limit on how much you can import before the app starts to slow down is definitely an odd choice that I would say more so highlights the iPad's tendency to prioritize seamlessness and responsiveness over the actual functionality of this device. I would say overall what that means is that it leads to the iPad being a very serviceable way to edit videos and video edit, so long as you are using the video editing app that you want to use being available on the iPad. So, DaVinci Resolve and Final Cut are pretty compromise-free. Some of the more iPad-specific ones like LumaFusion may have some compromises that you don't like or agree with, so that's always, important to make sure you have the app that you want. And two, that you don't have anything too high demanding, right? With a lot of color grading or raw codecs or visual effects. Like, even though I guess the point here is that even though the iPad is capable of doing it, there are limitations in the Jettison issue of it slowing things down and trying to improve responsiveness that make video editing a mixed bag. They make it from like, oh, this should be fantastic for video editing, to being like, oh, it's just pretty good, right? It's just like there's some great parts of it, but a lot of it is kind of rough. So that's why I say video editing is a pretty mixed bag. On that note, and kind of building off of that, pretty much any other app that isn't, again, as I mentioned, drawing, modeling, or note-taking has a similar kind of trade-off. I'm not going to bog the video down with every single example, but you should check the medium you are trying to look for and what the app functionality situation is like on iPad to make sure that it is in a good enough spot for you if you were looking at an iPad to replace a computer you own. I think that's quite important. If you are fine with what you're doing, if you're like, yep, I understand the limitations of this app I'm using and the situation on iPad, and you still want to go through with it and it works for you, that's awesome. Again, it's going to be up to you to determine what level of sacrifice or what level of jankiness you want, right? Because I think we're at a point now where iPad apps are getting very good and having little compromise, but there is still that inherent compromise in the fact that you are using a device that is, not form over function, but there's definitely a couple elements as you use it, as I demonstrated in that previous video, where some things are just unreasonably weird at an iPad level that they necessarily shouldn't be. And that's not necessarily an Apple thing. That could be the developer, as I mentioned. I talked about Affinity in my last video on this, and it's a similar thing where, like, the app shouldn't be that bad. It has the capability to be basically what the desktop is, but for a touch-friendly interface, and yet they have these weird design decisions that just make that not happen, right? So it's stuff like that. But again, as long as you're looking at, your medium, let's say you're trying to do animation, let's say you're trying to do, modeling or whatever, as long as you're looking for and you're like, yep, I'm happy with the things that are on iPad, I think you'll be doing just fine. The other point I want to mention here, as I mentioned at the start there, is I want to stress that, this iPad, as many people, for whatever reason, tried to say, will not replace your main computer. Because of what we mentioned in the JSN issue and because of the complexities relating to, app design and things, you should still have a main computer, preferably a desktop, Mac or Windows machine, to do the heavy lifting and for OS compatibility, right? So even if this if this iPad was able to do everything you wanted it to do, you should still have a option for the heavier workloads and, more importantly, for the compatibility of certain apps and certain functions, right? I think that the iPad Pro M5 can be a great addition to that, to the setup you have, and it can even replace a laptop in many regards, even being better than a laptop for a couple tasks, which we'll mention in a bit here. But I want to stress that, no matter the quality of the chipset, no matter how good this M5 chipset is, it's always going to be a better and more usable experience to use a full desktop OS for certain apps, especially ones that are exclusively web-based, because there's an issue, with a bunch of the WebKit stuff and some compatibility there, right, for certain apps and the functionality of certain apps on iPad. But as I mentioned at the top line there for the too long to watch, it is also up to user discretion about, making sure that, don't feel guilty that everyone is saying, oh, you can't use it as a replacement. Oh, don't you dare replace it. If you feel like you can replace it, go for it, And I think that should be a large takeaway here, is that you are not beholden to other people's decision in what you feel like you want to use your iPad for, right? If you want to feel like you can use it for things and everyone's telling you no, try it out. If you think, oh, I don't actually need a full-blown operating system for what I'm doing, then absolutely go for it, right? I don't think other people should necessarily discourage any of that. So that's a lot of, preamble or setup to now talking about what I think the iPad does well and why I still very much recommend it for a lot of people. Not necessarily most people, but I think a lot of people will have a very good time with this. So now that we've pretty much established why the iPad may not work for you, and why it oftentimes can't replace a main computer, I want to talk about why I still believe it's an incredible device and absolutely worth considering. So the reason I mentioned that the iPad Pro excels at things like drawing, modeling, sculpting, and note-taking is because, and this is very important, this is the benefit of having this operating system the way it is because the Apple exclusive apps for these mediums are excellent and, more importantly, extremely well designed to take advantage of its mobile base and its powerful chip. Part of why Final Cut Pro on the Mac feels so much better than Premiere Pro isn't just because it's an Apple product on an Apple device, it's because Premiere Pro is so bogged down by bloat and redundancies that is what I would call a heavy application. Something like WizTree, which is a free open source file manager, is a light application because it doesn't need constant internet connection, forced integrations, AI features, cloud storage, all the things in an app that add bloat and complexity. That same design process has gone into these iPad apps. They're simple and efficient. You don't need Autodesk Inventor with thousands of models and settings to 3D model something. You can use Nomad Sculpt, for instance. You don't need Premiere Pro to edit video. You can use Final Cut Pro. You don't need, heavy drawing apps or video, photo editing apps like Photoshop. You can use Procreate, right? You don't need the heavy industrialized versions of apps. You can use simpler, more effective apps. By using this simpler, more approachable app structure, the iPad becomes a choice for creators looking for both strength and efficiency. What this also allows it is not only it's more user-friendly and more touch-friendly, with the pencil or whatever you use, it also tends to be cheaper, right? Nomad Sculpt, for example, while not nearly as feature competitive with other modeling options, is still a great modeling app, and it is only $20 compared to things like Autodesk Inventor, which are, thousands of dollars a year. Same with Procreate. Procreate is an iPad exclusive drawing app, and for things like Notability for note-taking, right? Each of these apps are relatively cheap. I think Notability is $10, Procreate's like $13, and these are excellent apps designed for the iPad and benefit for that, and they don't really have any other equivalent. Like, you could spend more money on a different drawing app or open source thing, but you are not going to get the quality that Procreate is able to give you for nearly as cheap as Procreate is able to give you, because these are iPad exclusive apps, because these are designed for what they are, right? Because of this, you also get the advantage of not needing an annoying subscription, like Adobe products tend to do, or obtrusive ads, like Ibis Paint and some of these other free painting softwares or free drawing softwares, right? So that's awesome. While also being simple enough to not need a ton of resources poured into them to sustain development, so they can continue to update and give you free updates instead of what Adobe does, which is if you've bought CS6 or whatever, you're stuck with that because you bought it once for a bunch of money and now it's too expensive to continue development, so you don't get any updates, right? It's much better, I think, to have a model where you're not pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into the software so you can continue to develop and give these awesome updates, but you are charging enough that it becomes sustainable, right? It's just kind of a different model that I think the iPad really excels at showcasing that not a lot of others really do. So I think that's very nice, and I think it is a good middle ground between the free open source apps and the competitive, very expensive apps. So I will also, depending on how long this video takes to get out, I will most likely be doing a follow-up video to really get an understanding of why the iPad works so well for these apps, so maybe a more positive spin on the video you saw last time is possible. A more long-term review, if you will, but we'll see how long this video takes to get out. All right, so I've pretty much gone over what I don't think the iPad does well, what I think it does do well, the functionality and capabilities of the iPad, and obviously the Too Long Didn't Watch kind of setup of what we're trying to do. So let's actually talk about what we're trying to do here, which, if you remember, the goal of this is to get as many things that I use on my laptop that I used to do on the laptop to the iPad. I'm going to go one by one and see what the equivalents are. So as I said just a second ago, I'll be making up a follow-up video into more depth about each app once I've had more time with them. So let's just start one by one. For photo editing, replacing that one is pretty easy because I can use things like Affinity Photo, which is currently, at the time of writing this, unavailable due to the transition from a serif ownership to Canva. This means that when it does become available again on the iPad App Store, it will be a native app called Affinity. It will be free and should contain all versions of Affinity apps, Designer, Photo, and Publisher. So if you're looking for things like a graphic design app or a photo app or a publishing app and don't want to give Adobe money for Illustrator, Affinity's suite of apps, in this case, I'll be using Photo for photo editing and Designer for graphic design, are very good. As I mentioned there, the Affinity Suite will have native iPad apps coming shortly. However, in the meantime, they are using the previous version, the version 2, and you can simply download that, and then you can go into the trial. You click, start trial, and then you go into settings, and you enter and you buy, and it's basically free, right? You don't have to, it doesn't charge you anything, and then you have those apps. So I'd recommend those because they are free, because they are currently the only option. But if you're watching this video at a later date, you may not see that, and you may just see one green Affinity logo icon, and then that's the one you download. Okay, so just making that clear. There is that. Next up, we're going to be looking at video editing. This one is pretty simple. Unfortunately, while I do have Final Cut Pro on the Mac, the iPad version is a separate purchase, and it is a subscription model. So I will not be doing that. Instead, I'll be using what I've been using for a while now and download DaVinci Resolve for free. A very quick tip, and this is something that you absolutely should do if you are using DaVinci Resolve on the iPad. You can actually enable the other pages, like the full editing software, the delivery, the Fusion pages, and everything like that, by going to, I believe it's Command-Shift or Command-Alt-K. Open up the keyboard shortcuts, type in pages, scroll down to where you find the show pages button in the workspace, and then you can assign a keyboard shortcut. In this case, I do Control 1, 2, and 3, and then you hit save. You name it whatever you want, and now when you press those buttons, you'll see at the bottom it pops up. It will show up the little icons there, which is awesome because now you have access to the full editing suite and everything like that. Obviously, this works better on a 13-inch device, but it still works on the 11. All the functionality is still there, which is awesome. By default, the reason they hide this is because it's a lot more mouse focused, so you are going to want a mouse or a trackpad to navigate it. That's why it's hidden by default. But just know that if you are looking for an editor and you're very disappointed by the fact that it only has the quick edit and the coloring options, and you're like, well, I thought this was the full editor, you just have to do that little thing. It does not show up if you go to Workspace Show Pages. By default, that's hidden. So you do have to enable it through the shortcuts. But once you do that, as long as you have the shortcut set up, it should work no matter what. So that is awesome. So that is pretty good. Next up, we're looking at motion graphics software. I use Apple Motion for this in my old MacBook. So for motion graphics, Resolve has a built-in one called Fusion, which definitely is nice since it automatically integrates into the editing suite. But for now, since a lot of the motion graphics I want to really do will also be animated, I'll be using my animation software of choice, ToonSquid, to do motion graphics and animation, a dual function for that one. ToonSquid is a simple and clean animation app for iPad that's just $10, and it's made by one developer that handles both frame-by-frame animation and keyframe animations with basic bone setup. With the free 2.0 version, it now supports a ton of cool non-destructive editing effects as well as a rating system. Now, the fact that ToonSquid is made by one guy does mean that while it is quite credible and capable, it is also still a little basic and pretty messy. So, because of that, I will be using an old copy of Moho Pro 12.5 I picked up for about $30 that works well on Windows and Mac for more complete control over things like the rigging and animation process. If you're interested in how you can use any Windows app on iPad, I have a short that you should watch. It's only about 2 minutes, and it will tell you how to install and use any Windows app on iPad, including Moho and Paint.net and pretty much anything you want. So check that short out if you're interested in figuring out how you can use things like Moho, an app that shouldn't be usable on iPad, and use it perfectly well on iPad. So you can check that out. Finally, for development, this is where the iPadOS mobile nature does come into play, unfortunately. I believe while it is still Unix-based in that fact, it doesn't have the same structural benefits that make Unix systems good for development, mainly the ability to run apps natively without needing another shell or virtual machine. It also doesn't have a terminal, right? So for that reason and the fact that you can't access the terminal, as I mentioned, I will not be using the iPad for any development work. You can use Swift code. There is some development applications. I believe Xcode is also available, although don't quote me on that. So there's some development apps that you can use and that do work, but a lot of the more development that is not app focused, like terminal usage and installing Homebrew and stuff like that, installing FileZilla, right? Like a lot of the things you would want are not usable, unfortunately. But that doesn't affect me too much because I will not be doing a ton more development as I finished my internship where I needed to do a lot of that. So I think that's overall fine, but note, if you're trying to use this for development, it doesn't really work out. The lack of terminal and lack of the Unix functionality do kind of kill this for development work. All right. So now that we've set up pretty much everything I used the laptop for before and have added some new things like Procreate and ToonSquid for animation and drawing, let's talk about improvements over a laptop. So believe it or not, there are improvements over a normal laptop that this has, mainly in drawing and sculpting. Really anything that's able to utilize the Apple Pencil Pro, which I also bought along with this whole setup. I will probably talk about the setup in a sec in the end, most likely. So I'll talk about what I have and the setup I'm using in a sec. But I have found that anything that uses the Apple Pencil is quite improved, right? Also streaming, which we'll talk about. So for my setup here, I got the Apple Pencil Pro, which I got for $35 off, which made it $95 on Amazon. So while it is about as expensive of a drawing pencil as you can get, it is quite capable, right? So as a very basic rundown, improvements over the normal Apple Pencil, it automatically charges on the side of the iPad, which is a big feature, right? So you don't have to plug it in. And then there's a bunch of gestures, right? There's squeeze, there's double tap, there is barrel roll to change the trajectory of things, and then there is a haptic feedback for that, and there's a hover, so you can actually see where your pen's about to be. So that is quite nice. They're small things, I don't use the squeeze or the barrel roll a ton, but they are nice to have. Double tap I use a lot for the eraser. I do use the haptic feedback and the hover quite a bit, so it is a quite nice setup right there. I'm not going to get into too much detail because I probably will make a separate video on functionality of the Apple Pencil, but it does make drawing a lot better, in my opinion, using the Apple Pencil versus using another stylus, right? Now that is, obviously something that you cannot get with a laptop. Even two-in-ones that have a more tablet appearance, like the Surface laptops or the Lenovo Yoga series, do not have the responsiveness and the functionality that the Apple Pencil iPad combo has, right? To maximize that ability, you would have to have something like a separate drawing tablet, which would need to connect through HDMI and USB-C and all this stuff. It would be a quite more complicated endeavor than the functionality that this thing has. And this works for pretty much anything, right? It works for modeling, drawing, any element, or note-taking, right? Any element that really excels with that better precision of that stylus. So that's to note. Speaking of drawing tablets, by the way, I will be reviewing my Huion Canvas Gen 3 in the near future, so subscribe if you want to see more things like that and more creative-focused tech reviews. I also would do tech retrospectives for out of context, and I do general discussions on what's happening in the industry. So if any of that sounds good to you, subscribe for more videos as they are released. I also have a gaming channel, as I mentioned before, where I review games, other games you may not have heard about, and talk about game design weekly, so subscribe there if you want. All right, the other advantage that I mentioned in terms of how an iPad is better than a laptop is in streaming. Now, this actually comes in two flavors. Traditional streaming apps like Netflix and Apple TV work best on iPad since they are modified mobile apps, which means they have the correct DRM crap that allows them to work normally. Obviously, if you're familiar, if you try watching Netflix or something on a web browser and it doesn't have a native app, like, oftentimes the Mac and Windows don't have native functional apps. They have like weird progressive versions, which basically just means they're a web browser, right? They have crappy DRM, so it chops up the image and all that stuff. Because it's obviously, basically just a larger mobile app here, the iPad is able to use the full quality, depending on your subscription tier, of that streaming service. The other streaming service, as I mentioned in the short, and that's the thing I kind of talked about, was Moonlight, which is how you run any Windows app on an iPad. Again, you can check the short if you're more interested in that part of it. Now, obviously, something like Moonlight streaming your Windows PC is not ideal, but it does work, and it does let you stay all in one place on one device and have a complete workflow, which I do quite value. All right. Overall, in conclusion, the M5 iPad Pro is an incredibly capable device for a very specific subset of people. If you can take advantage of the benefits and the things that make it better for certain workflows, as I mentioned, you will have a phenomenal time with this device. However, as I said at the start, there are things that do not work well due to the iPad Pro's limited OS functions, mainly development of software and file management through imports. There have been great strides and capabilities to make iPad exclusive apps and iPad design apps work extremely well. And I think now it is mostly up to Apple themselves to fix these burdens to the iPad OS in terms of jettison and some other aspects that make it a little bit more irritating. But as long as you understand what you are getting into with this iPad Pro and you don't plan on replacing your main computer, I think I can confidently recommend this device and say that it really is an incredibly capable and functional device and that it is absolutely worthy of the praise that it is getting. All right. If you want to see more videos like this on the channel, make sure to like, subscribe, do all that, and I'll see everyone in the next video.